Thanks, Iftikhar, and welcome to Dr. Alimia and Dr. Hakimi. And I'm just briefly going to introduce both of our speakers. Dr. Sanaa Alimia is an assistant professor of political science at the Aga Khan University Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations. She is a recipient of the British Academy Small Grants Award for her research project, Digital Borders, Bodies, and Mobility in South Asia. Dr. Alimia's now book, Refugee Cities, How Afghans Transformed Pakistan, is out, just came out this year in 2022. Here I have a copy, excitedly reading it, with University of Pennsylvania Press. Dr. Alimia has previously held positions at the Leibniz Zentrum Moderner Orient in Berlin, the Department of Political Science, and in the University of Peshawar and in SOAS in London. And Dr. Aziz Hakimi holds a PhD in development studies from SOAS University of London, and his research and publications have addressed subjects including war and state formation, policing and local militias, and the intersection between gender, legal reform, marriage practices, and migration in Afghanistan and among Afghan diaspora in Turkey. And in terms of their format, Dr. Alimia will begin by talking about her book, and then we'll move to a conversation between Dr. Alimia and Dr. Hakimi, and after that, there will be some space for questions. So welcome to our speakers, who I believe are joining us from Kenya and Norway today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for the welcome, and thank you so much to invite me here, and of course Aziz Hakimi as well. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to everyone for joining us. I guess Aziz and I, we're going to start off, of course, speaking today about Refugee Cities, a book that looks at Afghan refugees in Pakistan. But when I was invited very kindly to participate in this session, I really wanted to be able to have a conversation rather than perhaps give a presentation and give a lecture about the book, although that has its own merits and its own benefits. But I also wanted to use this as an opportunity to speak with colleagues, friends, and people whose work I admire and respect, who are also working on Afghanistan and its broader diaspora, to be able to have a interesting conversation, but also teasing out some critical and important points. And so I reached out to the center, who were very kind and very willing and happy to invite Aziz along as a co-discussant. And I'm very pleased that Aziz, that you've been able to join me today. And I guess the way that the session is going to work is that you and I will introduce ourselves a little bit more for those who are in the audience, so they'll know why we're having this in conversation. And we will talk a little bit about points of convergence in our own work, as well as speaking about the specificities of the book Refugee Cities. And personally, I would say that one of the reasons why I'm so happy that Aziz was joining is because it's always good to be able to talk to other folks who are working on the region and have been doing so for quite a number of years and from quite a critical vantage point. So briefly, I'll introduce myself as Sanaa Alimia, the author of Refugee Cities, and maybe I'll say a little bit more about myself in a moment, but first of all, I'll hand over to you, Aziz, to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Sanaa. It's thank you for reaching out to me, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to talk to you today. I am trained as a sociologist at SOAS, and I've researched war, politics, and religion, some aspects of legal pluralism in Afghanistan, and lately gender and masculinity, and within that also a bit on labor migration, Afghans who I researched Afghan labor migrants in Turkey. I hold a PhD in development studies from SOAS, and you probably know a little bit about development studies at SOAS. It's an interdisciplinary program in international development, and it combines sort of political economy, economics, politics, sociology, and anthropology and history. So it's quite a mixed bag of things. For my doctoral research, because we're having this conversation later on, you and I, drawing on sort of points of convergence and maybe even differences in our work, I thought, it would make sense for the audience that I speak a little bit about sort of my research background and the kind of work I've done so far. So for my doctoral research, I studied the Taliban insurgency. This is again sort of a term that was used at the time. The Taliban would label their sort of struggle as a jihad against foreign invasion, a war of liberation, if you like. And alongside, of course, the Taliban insurgency, I also looked at the US and NATO counterinsurgency campaign. And in that context, I focused on militias, local militias that were called the Afghan local police. And the Afghan local police was basically a US military funded, trained proxy force. And it was basically stood up by the US military to fight the Taliban. It was originally, of course, conceived as a temporary measure while the National Army and the National Police were being trained and equipped. Thinking at the time was that, once the Americans and the Europeans, and there was always this division of labor between the two, the Americans were doing the army and the local militias, the Europeans were focused on policing, as part of the rule of law effort. And so the idea was, these militias would be demobilized once the army and the police were trained. But of course, as the war expanded and it got more bloody by the day, the militia program, of course, kept getting bigger and bigger. My main argument was that militias or militia leaders are best understood as coercive brokers. They play an important role in politics. They are not simply anti-state, or that they emerge when states weaken or fail or collapse. There are, a number of these terms that have been used for states in the global south, if you like, especially those emerging from conflict. So historically, militias have played an important role in expanding state power to the periphery, acting as state agents, similar in function to the Khans and Maliks of yesterday, who played a key role in mediating relations between colonial powers and later post-colonial elites and the local population. FATA is, of course, a relevant example here. I'm referring here to the federal administrative tribal areas, which, the term no longer exists. It's been incorporated, my understanding is, into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the province formerly known as NWFP. So in Afghanistan, we have a long history of militia groups acting as state proxies to police borders and local populations, extract resources, and mediate center-peripheral relations. So just like states and tribes are not always at war with one another, they should not always be viewed as enemies. I extended this logic to militias and state politics, trying to show how post-colonial states and new colonial and imperial powers collaborate with militias to expand control over territory, populations, and key resources. Of course, and there is, lessons to be learned when discussing states and markets in contemporary era as well, from Afghanistan to Myanmar to Colombia. Research has shown that militias play a crucial role in state formation and the workings of capitalist markets, and this is work that is done by colleagues at SOAS. Should mention Jonathan Goodhunt here. So militias are not simply anti-state and should not be understood as a function of a failed state or corruptors of states and markets. So that's sort of my doctoral work that I did. I left it for a while. I hope to return to it maybe next year. But post-PhD, I sort of expanded my research and focused on gender and masculinities, legal pluralism, marriage practices in Islamic societies. Of course, Afghanistan was the focus, and migration studies. I wanted to take a sort of a break from the study of elites and high politics and go down to their household and market level and study sort of non-elites but ordinary men and women, and how they live their lives in the context of war, displacement, poverty, but also through engagement in labor migration and trading practices to build and rebuild lives affected by these larger dynamics. And this probably at some point, maybe we can talk about it, could be a point of convergence. In your book, you mentioned that you focus on sort of ordinary people and their sort of their lives in Pakistan. I'm also currently affiliated with Chris Mickelson Institute here in Bergen, but also Global School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex. These two research institutes became my home for my project, New Afghan Man, Marriage, Masculinities and Gender Politics in Afghanistan, which was funded by the Research Council of Norway. And the last 2 years, because of COVID, and I could no longer sort of travel to Afghanistan, I also have been teaching here at the university in Western Norway. And maybe at some point we could also touch upon the difficulties, especially for people like me who can no longer go to Afghanistan and do research, and that maybe, something that we can pick up later. But for now, that's all I had to say in terms of setting the stage. Thank you.
Thanks.
Sorry if I took too long.
No, thanks, Aziz. I guess there are lots of points that we'll want to kind of touch on and talk about. And one of the points I think that we'll perhaps come back to after I've perhaps given a brief introduction about the book is that, of course, you and I are meeting again for the first time virtually after a number of years where we initially had first met at SOAS, as both doing PhDs at SOAS, very brief interactions, kind of aware of each other's work. And I think it'll be interesting for us to also think and reflect and perhaps draw out as the evening progresses about the ways in which we've seen the studies of Afghanistan transform within these past 10 years or so. Absolutely. Sometimes with amazing scholarship that's frankly emerging from scholars from Afghanistan and the broader diaspora, as well as others who are engaged in critical scholarship of Afghanistan. And also then those battles of the same old tired tropes that we are also having to engage with in the scholarship. And that's something that I'd be interested in speaking a bit about. But I guess perhaps I could start off with speaking a bit about the book. I know you had one of the questions or the outlines that we were going to talk about initially was basically what is the book about and what's perhaps the main argument about it. And I guess for the audience, some of whom will be familiar with the book, but of course some of whom will be meeting me and understanding Refugee Cities for the first time, this is perhaps the best place to start off by giving an introduction about it. So Refugee Cities, How Afghans Transformed Pakistan, is a book that builds on social histories, ethnography, and testimonies predominantly of low-income Afghans who have lived in urban areas in Pakistan for the past 40 years or so. And primarily I focus on Karachi and Peshawar. Karachi, the southern port city of Pakistan, and of course Peshawar on the northwestern parts of Pakistan bordering Afghanistan. In very, very simple terms, if anybody does ask me what the book is about, usually my inclination is to say that the book is written in the spirit very much of how social histories are written, how feminist histories, anti-colonial histories, working class histories are written almost in a Brechtian fashion, being inspired by Bertolt Brecht's A Worker is History, where Brecht asks almost, there are many grand buildings in the city, there are many grand buildings in history, who's built them? Was it not the workers and the like? And that had been part of the inspiration and the rationale for me to engage in this study. And much of study in very simple terms, if anyone asks, is usually that this is a story about how it is that migrants make cities, particularly those of low-income backgrounds. How is it that they provide both a cheap labor pool for projects of modernization and capitalist development, but also how, particularly in the global south, when we're talking about urbanization, we're often talking about urbanization in the vein that the late, great Mike Davis spoke about urbanization as mega cities emerging, or urbanization taking place on the rural to urban interface, where cities are becoming bigger and bigger, not necessarily because of industrialization and economic growth, but often because of the devastating impacts of structural adjustment programs in the rural areas. And you see the same thing applying certainly in the case in Pakistan, but you also have the added caveat, not only now increasingly of climate disaster, but also of conflicts, both within the country and also the broader region, as being a key factor as to why the city is changing, as a consequence of migrations, and how cities are being transformed. And so in one vein, Refugee Cities is very much about finding the Afghan story within the urban transformations of Pakistan cities over the past 40 years. But of course, the story is also a little bit more complicated than that as well, because it's also a story that's trying to weave in a number of disciplines, including geopolitics and political science and the study of great wars, as well as urban studies and as well as migration studies. And it's trying to tie these three different disciplines together through the stories of Afghans in Pakistan. And part of the reason and the rationale for writing the book is in a way to disrupt the standardized narratives. And when it comes to the study of Afghanistan and its diaspora in the Anglophone world, but also sometimes even within the context of Pakistan itself, where a lot of the times the stories tend to center in quite one-dimensional ways on imperial rivalries or geopolitics or counterinsurgency, or these neo-Orientalist lenses, if you will. And it's an attempt to kind of build on work that's been happening already by critical scholars of Afghanistan, including figures like Sheikh Mahmoud Hanifi, Anila Dolatsai, and a number of others, who are trying to get us to question the tropes that still seem to continue on in the study of Afghanistan. And part of the book and the rationale and the reason and how I end up looking at cities is not to necessarily ignore geopolitics and big geopolitical conflicts. The book is situated really between two major wars, the Soviet-Afghan War and various wars and conflicts that happen in between, and also the war on terror. But instead of perhaps focusing on military tactics per se, which of course are important in of themselves, but instead of simply focusing on this, I also wanted to use social histories and ethnographies of those who had been displaced into Pakistan, including sometimes, in some cases, former fighters or former so-called mujahideen and daily wage laborers and women and others, to write a regional history and a people's experience of international relations from below. What has it meant to live over 40 years of displacement in the context of Pakistan, where you have geopolitical effects and things taking place? Is that the only story, or what is happening in day-to-day life? So the book, and this is how I effectively came to understanding the story about how migrants make cities. The book then really goes on to examine the ways in which various displaced persons have, over a period of 40 years, really transformed Pakistan by building its roads, by building townships, by building massive informal housing areas, and trying to step beyond these understandings of Afghans in the context of Pakistan being refugees that are simply waiting to go home, a discourse that often is present in the humanitarian and developmental fields and discourse, or the bureaucratic goals of policymakers, but to show how it is that people can possess multiple complex layered identities. And it's often the city that enables these identities to take place, because you have diverse groups within the city who are living there, forming layered forms of belonging, where they may often have multiple forms of attachment, not necessarily to the nation, which can be jingoistic, it can be exclusionary, but certainly to the localities, the neighborhoods, and the cities of which they're a part. And it's during these processes of building the city, of transforming the city, of actually fighting for basic rights, water, sanitation, healthcare, and the like, that I find people start to develop greater attachments to their localities, their neighborhoods, and their communities. So that's been some of the efforts of the book is to try to write these untold or less familiar stories, if you will, with a focus on low-income Afghans in Pakistan, and trying to move away from primarily a focus on geopolitics. But I will add, just very briefly, that of course geopolitics is never fully absent from how it shapes and determines the lives of those Afghans across different ethnicities, Pashtun, Hazara, Tajik, Turkmen, and the like, and others in the country who are in the country. Geopolitics is not the only story, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a significant impact on folks' lived experiences. And in a very simple way, if you will, what the book uncovers is that, you know, for the Pakistani state, which has had quite an interventionist role in Afghanistan, particularly, of course, in the 1980s, but of course, even more so in quite insidious ways in the 1990s and 2000s. In the 1970s, 1980s, an Afghan presence would often be welcomed by the Pakistani state and the establishment, and the state dominated as it is by the military, because having a large diaspora in the country is quite useful for the geopolitical objectives and the goals of the state. In the 1990s, when you have the patronage of the Taliban, of course, by military factions and the military state and the establishment as well, the presence is not as useful as it was in the 1980s, but it's certainly not unuseful. So refugee camps don't close down, the presence in the country remains, and so on. And that story, of course, starts to change after 2001, where an Afghan presence within Pakistan is no longer seen as something that is geopolitically useful. The war on terror, of course, spreads into Pakistan, particularly its northern areas, but also into cities like the Punjab heartlands of Lahore, where you have big bombings taking place as the Taliban Frankenstein's monster starts to get out of control. And the Pakistani establishment starts to have a greater pressure of making sure that this border between Afghanistan and Pakistan becomes clearer. And what that means is that the lived experiences of these so-called ordinary folks that I'm focusing on becomes a lot more precarious and a lot more difficult to navigate. And so the book also documents that story in the latter half of the book, in terms of whilst folks are trying to make their lives work in the country that they're living in and the cities and the towns of which they're a part, it's not always an easy ride, if you will. And so that's just an introduction, if you will, to the book, so that the scene is set for those who are with us in the audience. And you know, we're looking forward to kind of questions about the book and about our work in the audience. But I guess, Aziz, we can, does that sound like a decent introduction to you? And maybe we can start going some back and forth now between the two of us. What do you think?
I think it was a very comprehensive introduction to the book. You touched upon, you know, many of the questions that will come up during our conversation. But I think you did a very good job in terms of, you know, giving us a nice layout of the main arguments, and I wanted to raise some of them, and we will do so. But perhaps maybe we can also, I mean, you mentioned, that Afghans have contributed to the transformation of cities. This is something that I like you to maybe explain later on. Also, the figure of the refugee, you keep sort of using the term refugees and migrants, and maybe, you know, you could speak to that a little bit, why you're making sort of these jumps. And Afghans also, you know, ordinary Afghans, and, you know, Afghan reality in Pakistan, as you rightfully pointed out, it's quite layered, it's quite complex. So maybe at some point we can talk about that as well. But I wanted to maybe prompt you a little bit and ask you what motivated and inspired you to carry out this research and write the book. You know, perhaps give us a sense of your research journey, if you will. You know, you are, I understand, you know, you're not an Afghan, so, you know, there must have been an inspiration somewhere to prompt you to do this work. Maybe speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I think, so I think there's always there's multiple reasons to why I guess we choose the topics that we choose. And certainly I'm not Afghan, so it's you're choosing to write about something or a part of communities and part of a national group that you're not a part of. But there are many Afghans, of course, I would often see and be a part of within the urban fabric of Pakistan growing up. So it wasn't necessarily that the folks that I would go on to work with and engage with were completely alien. They were people who were part of the neighborhood or part of the apartment building in my khala's house or in Karachi or something like this. So there was certainly a familiarity, but I also think that perhaps my own lived experiences of being a migrant in Europe and a racialized migrant in Europe perhaps alerted me when I started to critically think about topics as somebody who's always had one foot in both the global north and the global south, and that's how I grew up living in between Pakistan and the UK. I would see, for example, how it was that low-income Pakistani migrants, but there could also be other migrants within the UK, would often be racialized and subject to various layered forms of discrimination and structural discrimination. And what was interesting for me within the context of Pakistan is that I would often see similar debates and similar experiences happening in the context of Pakistan with Afghan migrants at the national level or mediascapes, where you'd have the figure of the refugee, the figure of the non-national as being racialized or spoken in quite negative terms. But the experiences of those who were living alongside each other in the neighborhoods and in the communities wasn't necessarily one of hostility. So I think not always, certainly in the neighborhoods that I was a part of, but the state-led narrative could often be, where you'd have these tropes and it'd be like, oh yeah, there's lots of drugs in Karachi and that's to do with the Afghans, like racialized stereotypes. And so I think I was perhaps intrigued and pushed toward that direction because of my own experiences, where I wanted to also understand a migration story in the context of Pakistan, perhaps, and being alerted to some of those layers and nuances of discrimination because of my own experiences in Europe. So I think that's perhaps something that prompted the discussion. And also think that there's a lot of new and interesting work that's increasingly emerging in the South Asian context and Central Asian and the Global South generally on citizenship, migration and belonging. But often, the story can often be reduced to kind of one, it's not as detailed if you look at all of citizenship studies, there's a dearth of literature that we see emerging from the European context. And I was intrigued to see, well, can we learn another story about belonging and citizenship from the context in which I was working and operating in? And so that's perhaps one of the reasons why I focused on this. And then there were also practical considerations. I'm, a Kashmiri, for example, on my mother's side of Kashmiri, and I would absolutely have always say this, I would have loved to have done work also in the Kashmir context, but of course we have practicalities of what we're able to engage with on the field and not, and I know that you're kind of dealing with this question now, right, in terms of what field sites will you be able to engage with, and I would have wanted to work in Kashmir and Srinagar or Baramulla and all these other sites, but the surveillance regime for somebody who is a Pakistani national or has Kashmiri background or something becomes quite difficult. So I said to myself, okay, well, I will do work in spaces that I can have access to and in an area and a topic that I am interested and intrigued by. And that's perhaps one of the motivations for the research. And of course, there's also this kind of fascination almost, and I think Emila Zolizai, Sahar Ghamkhor and Sadia Tur, they wrote a really interesting article in Jadaliya recently, where they also speak about kind of this neo-Orientalism or this fascination with Afghanistan, even within the South Asian context, right, where Afghanistan is orientalized in an immeasurable way, even within, not forget like the Anglophone world, forget the US and the UK, but also within the South Asian context. We can think of Bollywood films, and of course, Amitabh Bachchan comes to mind as well, right? But of course, also within the Pakistani sphere as well. And these are questions that we need to ask ourselves as scholars, as why do we engage in this work? What's our position within that? And I think part of the reason and the rationale and the questions that were raised by this recent kind of intervention and critical call to think and get us South Asianists who are not Afghan to think in more critical ways of how we engage with Afghanistan, was to perhaps also question these tropes that are emerging not just from the Anglo-American world, but also from within our own worlds as well. And our burden and responsibility to kind of unpick those tropes and do away with them, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, the question of representation is, I think, a very important one, and I'm glad you sort of brought it up. But at some point, do also sort of expand on what these tropes are in the context of course, your own research and the book that you wrote. While I read it, there were a couple of things that stood out for me, because I also, there was a time that I briefly lived in Pakistan, in Peshawar and in Islamabad, and and every time the relations between the two countries sours, Afghans are kept reminded that be grateful, we sort of housed you, we looked after you, and don't be namak haram and all that. But in terms of like, Afghans brought the Kalashnikov culture, and Afghans brought the drugs culture, and so on and so forth. I think those are important. Those are important sort of tropes that I'd like you to speak to at some point. One of the things that I, maybe it's of some interest to our audience would also be to speak a little bit about whose work inspired you. We of course, we all have mentors, we've all read. You've mentioned Anila. It seems to me that you're inspired by her work, but could you maybe speak a little bit to that and give us a sense of who are the...
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a number of folks who are kind of being inspired by both folks who are working on Afghanistan and its broader diaspora, and then others who are working on other topics. Anila's work has been particularly important, I think, because she does the very difficult task of being incredibly generous, because she's very critical of how knowledge is produced on Afghanistan, which puts her in that position of kind of having to do the emotional labor of effectively calling out people in a way that's constructive and trying to build better knowledge production on Afghanistan, and for getting us as scholars and human beings to question how we're producing knowledge. And, I remember reading her works when I was writing the book, and I was particularly her work on the discursive occupation of Afghanistan, and finding that as, and the relationship of gender and tropes, particularly when it comes to how Afghanistan is constructed and the policy world and the like, has been quite an important framing for us to think about how we produce knowledge on Afghanistan, and to do it in critical ways, and to question the epistemic frameworks that we're using, but also the real nexus of knowledge and power, and how that links up to military interventions and the like. And so certainly that's been a big influence on my work. And I think it's a very generous kind of way of doing work, to be able to put yourself in that position where you're asking very tricky questions to your colleagues and the scholarly community and people who are making knowledge, as well as others as well, and holding others to account as well, not just the academic community, but also those who really do wield power in terms of material impacts of day-to-day life. And then, of course, there's been other scholars within the Afghanistan nexus and framework. Shah Mahmood Hanifi's work, of course, was also very important in trying to get us to rethink about Afghanistan beyond the nation state boundaries, and both across time and across space in the South and Central Asian contexts, and his deep history and reading of Afghanistan, as well as, unpacking what it means to be Pashtun and its links to a Persianate culture as well, and those linkages. And then in terms of the work on urbanity, I think I've got different audiences, right? Because of the work is influenced by different spaces and disciplines. But certainly on the side of urban studies, and certainly in the ways in which I wanted to interrogate what the city means and what it looks like. The late, great Mike Davis, as I've mentioned, was of course a massive influence on my work. I remember consuming Planet of the Slums in 2 seconds and wanting to understand how it is that the global South cities are expanding at such a rapid pace. And in that similar vein, there were others who were working on informality in Egypt, Diane Singerman's older work. There was, of course, of Asif Bayat's work on informality, which was a massive influence on my work. So it was these kind of folks, because initially the project started off as wanting to understand how it is that these cities are transforming and how these megacities are transforming, or how Peshawar is urbanizing, influenced by the works of Mike Davis and Asif Bayat and others working on urbanity. And then it started to become a bit more complicated with bringing in the stories of geopolitics and the like. So I think those have been the influences, but there's also been activists / organizers who've done really important work on the ground in the context of Pakistan. I'm thinking of folks in the Orangi pilot project, Arif Hassansab, Parveen Rahman, who was killed a few years ago, who'd worked on water issues in Karachi. And of course, there's really interesting work coming through from the Urban Research Lab in Karachi and Nosheen Anwar, who are really trying to understand what the city looks like in the context of Pakistan, and also including the position of various migrant groups within it. So migrants from within the context of Pakistan, those who've been displaced, as well as Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans, Somalis, refugees from Myanmar as well, who find home in Karachi. So it was a contribution of these different spaces and different disciplines that was a real motivation in terms of that. But then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, like these old school bread and butter kind of like socialist readings of the 20th and 21st centuries were also kind of there in the background, right, of wanting to understand.
Yeah, I mean, when I read your chapter in Karachi, I think this sort of the regional the sort of layers of migration, both, from within Pakistan, of course, you've had the floods, you've had the, insurgency and the counterinsurgency operations in different parts of Pakistan, but also, you've talked about Somalis and others, and Karachi being sort of this melting pot, if you like. And within that, of course, there's the Afghan reality. And you focused on the informal settlement. But since you mentioned Karachi already, I wanted to also ask you, why did you focus on Peshawar and Karachi? Why not, for example, Quetta or Lahore or Rawalpindi? I mean, there's a sizable number of Afghans in these cities, and, they also are part of sort of this urban reality. Some of them are traders, some of them, like the Turkmens that I interviewed in Istanbul, they were involved in manufacturing carpets, and of course, when you go back to sort of, and I asked them a little bit about the sort of history of migration. They remember that their grandparents came from Bukhara, then they settled in the north of Afghanistan. Then the Soviet invasion drove them to Pakistan, ended up somewhere in Saudi Arabia, and then finally, I met them in Istanbul. So there's been all sort of this sort of regional migration that's been going on. But tell us a little bit about, why did you choose these two field sites? Was it ease of access? Did you have family relation there, former histories, ethical concerns, security concern? Give us a sense of that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good and important question, actually. So I did actually do fieldwork a little bit in Islamabad rather than Bindi. And actually doesn't really make it into the book, just for ease of kind of readership and setting the scene and the like. And really it was about practicalities of the field sites. I think Karachi, I think I purposefully wanted to do research in Karachi, and the conditions meant that I was able to do research in Karachi. And by the conditions, I mean that I had what I thought was a good social support network of family and friends, and a place that I would be able to stay in, that would allow me to be able to do research. Because at the time when I started the research, single Pakistani woman, 20s, doing field work in informal housing areas, you really are thinking about, I was anyway, thinking about the practicalities of being able to get to a field site in the morning and then be home. Like, you leave after Fajr, come home before Maghrib, leave, being on the field in the daylight hours, and then also being able to come to a home that I felt comfortable and safe with. And a similar thing applied, of course, also in Peshawar. And I have family across all cities apart from Quetta, so also Lahore, Islamabad could easily have been chosen. Lahore is actually a city I grew up in, and it's perhaps precisely that reason, because it was so close to home, and we had a number of personal issues that I was like actually emotionally just didn't feel that I could live in the city that I felt probably the closest to in Pakistan for personal reasons. So I thought actually it was a purposeful avoidance of Lahore. It's only in more recent years that I've started to go back to Lahore. But I say that, and at the same time, I think, I also wanted to do research in Quetta, but I don't have family there. And I think that I wasn't wanting to do research where I would just parachute in and out, or live in a completely insider outsider way. And I also know that the security situation in Balochistan, given the ways in the heavy-handedness of the military surveillance within Balochistan, would mean that I don't know if it would be ethical enough for me to go there and do research and have research assistants when I didn't have a big grant, for example. The SOAS grant was lovely, but it's not particularly lavish enough to hire enough researchers. So the ethical considerations of what would I be able to do in Quetta in terms of research, how would I be able to rely on research assistants? Would I want to put research assistants in a position of risk? Because to research Afghans in Pakistan anyway is already, you have to alert yourself to state figures, because, for example, you can't enter a refugee camp without getting clearance and security clearance. Yeah. And you have to kind of make yourself known. And if you don't, you'll get a nice little knock on your door from somebody who knows where you've been. So there are those considerations, but there are also the considerations of both Karachi and Peshawar being very, very important cities to the Afghan story. I think in many ways, I think you're right that the Afghan story would be important in each of the cities. You could write a very important story about Afghans in Quetta. You could write an important story about Afghans in Islamabad, Rawalpindi, Lahore, Faisalabad, even Gujranwala. You can write all of these stories. But I think that Karachi is one of the sites in which there hasn't been that much research. It started to change a little bit, but I remember the late Mariam Abu Zahab had said that, there should be more research on Afghan nationals across different ethnicities living in and working in Karachi, because the Afghans in Karachi are, of course, not just Pashtun, but are predominantly from other ethnicities, Tajik, Turkmen, Uzbek, and Hazara as well. At least around about 50% are from those ethnic groups. So I think that the Afghan story in Karachi was an important one that needed to be told, and that hasn't been told as much as it should be. And I think there's important works that are challenging that a little bit. And then Peshawar, of course, is a city now where 1 in 5 today residents of the city are Afghan nationals. That's a significant minority. It's not insignificant number. And I thought that was an important reason to be able to focus on that. So there were a mixture of things, both practical considerations of what it means to be doing field work as a woman who's read as a local, understood as a local in these areas, and personal decision-making, as well as kind of the stories that I thought were important to tell. And then there's also considerations of writing. Islamabad effectively got cut out because I was like, okay, I can't put my readers through these stories. And I thought to write a simpler story that was easily accessible, perhaps focusing on these 2 cities would be a bit more of a better way to tell the story.
Thank you for sort of taking us through the journey. I think it's important also for the audience to know sometimes we have to make these kind of hard decisions and sort of think of the practicalities of a research project. I see that we're approaching almost 45 minutes, maybe 50. So I call upon the moderator, if you're overstepping the time boundary, to discipline us. But I had one more question that I wanted to put to Sanaa, and then maybe we can open it to the audience, if that's how you want to,
That sounds great. Yes, please pose your question, and I invite people to start to brainstorm questions to put in the chat. Thank you, Aziz.
Good. Sanaa, I'm going to combine 2 questions into one, because you've already you already talked about, the choice of your field sites and, and the consideration that went into that. So maybe say a little bit about, how it was as a sort of a non-Afghan to research Afghans in Pakistan. I was thinking of, access to state institutions and bureaucracy, certain geographies, FOTA was something that that came up in our conversations. You've already talked a little bit about, your field sites. But I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned, the title of your book also sort of makes allusions to that Afghans have contributed to urban life in Peshawar and Karachi, the two cities that you've studied. I wanted to sort of get you to tell us a little bit more about what what was the contribution or the main contribution of Afghans to Pakistani societies in these two cities. Was it mainly economic? Was it cultural? And if so, give us a few examples. But also, what about, stories of survival in the face of immense precarity? Because, you were researching Afghans who mostly lived in these informal camps. These were sort of the lowest economic ladder in society, very vulnerable, and because they were not accepted as refugees and as nationals, so their precarity is even more so in that context. But also do you think we need to also question sort of this neoliberal economic logic and its tendency to portray refugees as resilient, entrepreneurial, and productive for them to matter? Because this is something that I came up in the work of some of my colleagues who are doing work on refugees in Jordan and I think in Syria. So give us a sense of sort of what exactly is the contribution of Afghans and to Pakistani societies in these two cities.
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, my main focus is on the lower income groups, which actually is the bulk of, is the majority group of Afghans in Pakistan. It's not the only group, of course. There are middle class, middle income, and of course elite ones as well within that story. But Afghanistan also, in Pakistan, the majority of Pakistan population also live below the poverty line as well. It's part and parcel of the story of societies in which we focus. One moment, because my microphone may have stopped. So let me just, So, I mean, so part of, but of course, my main focus lower income group, and what I try to say really, or try to focus on, is perhaps not necessarily that idea that Afghans contribute, but that Afghans are makers. And the reasons why, and I think you and I were talking about this earlier offline the other day, when we were saying that often one finds themselves confronted with this idea that, they're very hardworking, the Afghans, migrants, they're really hardworking, and they've contributed a lot to the economy, they've done a great job. And my argument is actually no, where Afghans have contributed alongside others of that similar class standing, they're not contributors, they are makers, they are fundamental to the reasons why you have certain success stories in the context of Peshawar, for example. We were talking about Hayatabad, the township, of course, that was built in the 70s, 80s, predominantly by cheap labor. It's considered the architectural jewel in Peshawar based on Islamabad's planned city. And a lot of the ability of those early phases of being able to be built in the way that they were built is, of course, because that entire kind of construction project relied on the cheap labor of Afghans. And for those Afghans and the people at least who I interviewed, the laborers who worked on those sites, they didn't say that they were contributors. They said we were makers. Hayatabad, I remember standing with someone, and I don't think this made it into the book. I think it's perhaps part of another article, but I remember seeing somebody working and he was in his informal housing area and you could see Hayatabad in the distance. He's like, yeah, we made that. that's ours. Like, you know, it's not necessarily a, and his statement was a recognition of their labor that hasn't been recognized by mainstream debates, majority of debates, because of both of nationality, but also of class standing and class positionality. And I thought that was very important to kind of, and I think that's an important distinction, I guess, that you're trying to get me to tease out a little bit, right? In the sense that it's not necessarily just a contribution, but it's showing how people make the city and the success stories. And then you also kind of speaking a little bit about this idea and this notion of precarity, because of course a lot of the stories in the book are not necessarily just about making the city in these townships, but they're also about making the city in informal housing areas where people's lives are very precarious. And so their stories of survival and of resilience or attempts at kind of thriving are not necessarily stories that I've tried not to romanticize, because there isn't really romance in poverty and the suffering of those people who are having to live and endure these lives. And I say that because the folks who were living in the informal housing areas that I was working in, and who understood that their poor access to water or their poor access to building materials or healthcare or infrastructure and hospitals was particularly difficult for their own experiences. For those people who I worked with, they never kind of said, you know, we're suffering because, they would be like, no, we are suffering because the state, the international institutions or intermediaries are actually failing us, and that's what the issue is. It's clear there wasn't a sense of false consciousness for them, and that was really striking. I think I found particularly striking. In terms of cultural imprint and real, you know, like there are of course real markers of cultural imprint across cities like Karachi, across cities like Peshawar, and also in rural areas. And of course this book is about the city, because the city becomes the site in which people are attracted to because of job opportunities, because of chances to get better access to healthcare and education and the like. But what you find, in particularly in places like Peshawar, where you have a rural to urban interface, and the city is kind of expanding horizontally, you also see a significant contribution of Afghans in the rural parts of those urban areas or those rural to urban interfaces. Some of the contributions, by this I mean some of the significant contributions that are understood within the popular discourse of, say, Peshawar and the broader Khyber Pakhtunkhwa region. A popular one is, well, you know, the Afghans who came from rural areas have really transformed the crops of the region. They've transformed the plants, they've transformed what is grown in the region, because they have been able to cultivate this land in a different way and have learned and taught new skills to farmers and to agriculturalists within the region. So that's been one of the ways. And then there are, of course, you know, like if I talk about silly ways, you know, in Peshawar, often people are like, well, Afghans are much more fashionable than the local Peshawaris. So in young men's dress, or even like certain types of fashion. And if you go into the shops, or how weddings are held, or the types of desserts and sweets, and, you know, this green tea culture, you know, if we're talking about the most, you know, silly and superficial ways, the tea culture, of course, is influenced in many ways by, of course, what's transformed and happened over the past few years. And so you'll have to my camera starting on and off. I'm hoping that you guys can still hear me, but it's popping on and off a few times, but I'm hoping it's not interrupting with the audio. So you have those transformations in cultural terms, you know, of the small and the mundane things, and then the things that you hear in day-to-day language from fashion, from culture, but also in terms of real material kind of transformations of the city as well. You know, if you think, a lot of the groups and the communities and the areas that I worked in were not just Afghan communities, they were also Pakistani communities, where you have Pakistanis and Afghans living side by sides, where you have marriages taking place across ethnicities and across nationalities as well. One of the biggest challenges, of course, that many people are fighting on the ground now in terms of rights is, you know, when Afghan men marry Pakistani women, they don't automatically get Pakistani citizenship, but this is something that people are trying to contest, particularly for those women who have had to have their husbands be subject to threats of deportation, and in some cases have been deported. So you have a spectrum of, there's a myth almost of, lack of exchange between kind of groups and of cultures, but of course, you have shared languages, you have shared ethnicities. Yep. Chapters, one of the opening sections of the book, of course, opens with engineer Aziz, who is somebody who marries in, and his children marry into Pakistani families in the end as well. So I think those are some of the ways, I guess, and some of the changes that you see taking place. So I guess that's perhaps the question, and I know that we're going to open it to the audience. I'm going to actually do. Give me 1 minute, everyone, and I'm just going to actually just take off, so the microphone will not be as good, but we'll stop having the camera turning on and off now, as I just changed my camera. But I hope, Natasha, is that okay? I did have 1 or 2 questions for Aziz as well, because I kind of wanted the audience to get to just hear a bit from him, but I think perhaps now is a good time to also welcome in the audience, and whilst people are doing that, maybe I'll ask a question.
That sounds great. Yeah, please share a question with Aziz, and we'll wait for some questions to come in the chat, or if folks are interested in asking a question, you can raise your hand or write your name in the chat and unmute yourself. So please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I want to, of course, start by thanking Aziz for kind of, you've just taken the time to read the book and to kind of go at it a little bit in detail, but I perhaps wanted to talk to you a little bit about your own work, because part of what I'm looking at is, I guess, folks who move to Pakistan and stay in Pakistan and build up new homes and new worlds there. And you've also been looking at kind of like how it is that folks move and folks circulate. And you've also been looking at the politics of and the ways in which people stay and don't move, the reasons and the rationale why perhaps people stay and don't move. So I perhaps wanted just to ask you just a little bit about how you see, the decisions, I guess, that people make when they're choosing to move or to not move, and how that's how you read that in your own work, and how you saw that or perhaps didn't see that in Refugee Cities. And then the other question I think that's perhaps interesting for us to think about is also, you kind of raise it and allude to it in this discussion as well, but when we talk about Afghanistan, and of course I'm talking about Afghanistan and Pakistan, we're really talking about a whole regional kind of space because of the migration and mobility question. So perhaps maybe you could talk a little bit about that with regards to your own work, and also just the study of Afghanistan in of itself, and then we'll hand over to Natasha. Then we're in your hands, Natasha.
And we actually have a question in the chat that I think dovetails with your question, Sanaa, so maybe I can add that, and Aziz, if perhaps you could address that, and Sanaa as well. In addition to Sanaa's questions, maybe you could please address Faiza's question about the linearity of migration, and whether you've both in your fieldwork observed that migration is bidirectional or circular, what the patterns are. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, let me start with Faiza's, to answer Faiza's question, and then I can sort of bring in and address Sanaa's question as well. In the work that I do on the Afghan Turkmens who've interviewed and worked with in Turkey, they are not sort of engaging in the sort of a linear migration sort of story, that they leave Afghanistan and they have a final point of destination, which is true in the case of some Afghans, say, for example, to go to Europe. These are migrant workers who have families back home. And the reason, and this may also tie in with Sanaa's question, the reason they leave are quite complex. They are to do with poverty, some of it to do with maybe the war displaced their family and destroy whatever assets they own, land, animals. Suddenly they have to find new means of survival, and if they cannot find those means of survival within the country, then they are pushed outside and would seek work, say in Pakistan, in Iran, the Arab Gulf countries. Turkey, at the time when I was doing research, Turkey was a sort of an attractive destination. Now it's very difficult to, get to Turkey. There's a lot of deportation that's happening. Of course, the economy is not doing so well. But at the time when I interviewed Afghans, quite a few of them told me that, they left Pakistan to go to Turkey because the wages are better. There's more work. Others left Iran because of sanctions and the slowdown in the economy, and would go to Turkey. And there was a lot of sort of exchanges, social exchanges that were involved. Friends and families in Turkey would basically pay for the journey of those who are leaving Afghanistan. So there is a lot of sort of this transformation of, if you like, economic capital to social capital and back and forth. New relations were built, including through marriage and sponsorship, sponsoring labor migrants. So in that sense, at the time when I was doing research, Afghanistan, we still had, the war was going on. There was quite a lot of intense fighting in the north, in Juzjan, in Faryab, and even in the vicinities of Mazar-e-Sharif. So there was a lot of fighting was happening there. A number of my informants were telling me that they had to move their families from there to Kabul, and then they, if there were 2 or 3 brothers, they would have decide one would go to Pakistan, the other would end up in Turkey. And that's how they supported their families. And some of them, would already have relations, for example, in Turkey. There was also quite a number of Turkmens that left Pakistan in the 80s to go to Turkey. So they had relations already in Turkey. And as I mentioned earlier, they would use those kind of connections to get visas or get or smuggle themselves. Of course, there were quite a lot of these human trafficking networks that are involved, because Afghans have to pass through Pakistan, Iran to get to Turkey. So there is a lot of borders to cross, and those borders have become very difficult to cross now. And there's, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of displacement. And in the case of the 2 brothers that I mentioned in one of the papers that I did on the migration story, they were deported twice, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So there is a lot of back and forth in that sense as well. They go to Turkey, they get arrested, they're sent back, then they make another attempt to get back to Turkey because they had work, or that was sort of more they could find work, and they had sort of connections and relations there in the labor market. And every time that happened to them, they would lose part of their assets, part of the money that they had earned and saved. So quite a lot of heartbreaking stories, really. And in that sense, I use the word circular migration. I mean, the term circular migration to describe these sort of movements back and forth between Afghanistan, where they have their families, and Turkey, where they work, but also would come back to Afghanistan to get married, form families, and go back in order to support those families. And sort of, as one of the respondents was telling me, we'll probably have to do this for the rest of our lives, because, that's sort of the mode of production and reproduction that they were involved in.
Thanks so much.
We have another question. Go ahead, Sanaa.
No, I'll take the question, then we'll come back. Thanks,
Okay.
Natasha.
Yeah, so we have a question from Shivani, who's asking about interweaving. Listening to you, we learned a lot about the interweaving between nationalities, Afghan and Pakistani, but could you also please speak to commingling and intermingling between various Afghan ethnicities? Shivani mentions Pashtuns, Baloch, Tajiks, and Hazaras.
In Pakistan?
I imagine, or it would be interesting. In Turkey, we have refugees from both places. So
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's yeah, in terms of this interweaving between various Afghan ethnicities. Yeah, certainly. I think you had the story, of course, of various Afghan ethnicities is full of its own complexities and layered that don't necessarily just disappear in diaspora as well, and in contexts where folks migrate into. And I found certain, I certainly found that there were, shared kind of links between, of course, of language and of culture, and sometimes of lived experiences of violence. For example, the Hazara communities that you find on both sides of the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Some Hazaras, of course, also have Pakistani citizenship and have had done for a number of years, as Alessandro Monsuti's work and others' work is also kind of examined and showed. And of course, what you would find is that often, and there's also the brilliant work of Rabia Latif and a number of others who are kind of looking at more contemporary issues and who focus on this in more depth and more detail. And it wasn't really the focus of my work to draw out the ways in which different ethnic groups and focusing on ethnicity per se, but certainly it's something that I did see is that, of course, in Karachi, where you have large Hazara Afghan settlements, is that often they would kind of seek out folks who they knew who had already been living in the city, or who they might have known from Balochistan and from Quetta in particular, and would seek out those groups to be able to form linkages, to use culture and languages, or to find out tricks of how to be able to navigate, survive the city, get access to jobs and housing and the likes. And then, of course, for Pashtun speaking peoples and Pashtun groups, you have similar kind of experiences. And I certainly found that the Karachi story was perhaps quite an interesting one, a little bit different to the Peshawar story in terms of the mixing of populations, where it would often happen side by side, where you would have Pashtuns, Afghan and Pakistani mixing together. But you'd also have, in Karachi's context, I found was quite interesting. It didn't apply to Hazaras, but it often would apply to Tajik Turkmens, who would often be lumbered in the same Afghan/Pashtun bracket, and would often find themselves living in the similar shared kind of informal housing areas as well. So I think that's a interesting kind of question. I don't know if I've understood it correctly. I'm hoping that you were asking about how different ethnicities mix amongst each other and across those different ethnic groups. So I'm hoping that that's given some insight.
So we have another question from Stephanie, and if you get a chance, I'd love to hear you also elaborate on ethnicities within Pakistan, how other communities who also experience a sense of disenfranchisement position themselves to Afghan refugees. I'm thinking recently of recent controversies between, really sad to see, like Sindhi nationalist and Afghan refugees and some of the kind of xenophobic migrant rhetoric. But Stephanie Savell asks about Afghan refugees seeking better access to healthcare and education by migrating to urban Pakistan, and if they do indeed achieve some measure of better access to public infrastructures in Pakistan than they would have in Afghanistan, and would like to hear more about that.
Well, one, I haven't lived and done work and research in Afghanistan, so what I will say is not going to probably, Aziz might have a better kind of like understanding of public healthcare and infrastructure in the Afghanistan context. But I know that certainly when we look at developmental indicators and indices, of course, that many of the cities and towns and rural areas in Pakistan do have better access to healthcare infrastructure and roads and the like. And that was often one of the reasons why people would justify their reasons for wanting to stay and desiring to stay in cities like Karachi or Peshawar. Peshawar, of course, has a number of areas where the main hospital kind of patients in private areas of Hayatabad's phase 5, for example, are often those who are coming from Afghanistan, where the signs in the hospital of the private hospitals are in Dari, Pashto, Urdu, and you also have English as well there. So you certainly have got better access to, in some cases, that was the rationale that was given, being able to access healthcare, education, and the like. The more interesting question for me, of course, is why does Pakistan have better access to healthcare, education, and the like? why is it that Afghanistan has been in the situation where over 40 years people are still having to use migration as a survival strategy or migration as a way to improve their lives? And the big elephant in the room will also, of course, always come back to that point, is that various interventions in Afghanistan, including from external folks, whether it's the Soviets or the Americans, but also their neighboring country of Pakistan, is an important reason as to why people have to migrate in the first place and why people continue to have to use migration as a survival strategy. And Aziz and I were, talking about this as well. We get a nice pat on the back to the Pakistan's, particularly within policy discourse around refugees and migration of, done a great job as hosts. Well, yeah, but there's a reason why their situation hasn't fully improved in a number of years. So I hope that gives a bit of my take on it.
Yeah, if I may just jump in. I mean, the reality in Afghanistan today, at least in the past year or so, it's pretty stark. The health system, which was, heavily dependent on foreign funding, that has been cut. Some of it's been, there's been attempts to sort of help the health sector at least. But so you've got a really situation where, at least in rural areas, most of the health clinics are no longer funded and no longer functioning. There was, of course, a lot of doctors as part of what in Farsi is referred to as takhliya, or evacuation. A lot of them were evacuated, and even I'm glad that Sanaa, you mentioned that despite all these billions of dollars that were going into the health sector, even in 2014 when I was doing work, 2015, there were quite a lot of health tourists. That's how the media termed them. Afghans going to India, Delhi was a destination. Going to Pakistan, to Turkey, even the Arab Gulf states, those who were a little bit, had more money. Because the hospitals in Afghanistan were not able to sort of cater to the more complex cases. The health system was basically the basic package of health services. That's what USAID funded, which didn't include sort of, the high-end hospital care services. And for that, Afghans had to go to neighboring countries. And now that the health system is such a terrible state, there's, I think, more pressure on Afghans to go to neighboring countries. But because of closed borders, it's not easy. I don't have any sense as to what's really happening in Pakistan. From sometimes you hear stories in the media of how difficult it is to get a visa to Pakistan, costing hundreds of, sometimes even thousands of dollars. That's an impossible situation for ordinary Afghans. To get a visa, go across the border, and seek medical care when at home a lot of them would have lost jobs. There is no more the aid industry has basically come to a standstill. So yeah, the situation is at least on the Afghan side is really, really terrible right now.
Yeah, and I think if it's okay, Natasha, just to jump in, I think that's a really important point that kind of ties in, I guess, to the comment that came from Stephanie in terms of accessing infrastructure and health. The border between Afghanistan and Pakistan has not been an easy one post 2021, even prior to that, but especially post August 2021 to cross. Both the land borders were often closed and not closed. And actually, if you did try to cross them, because obviously, you would often, many people would be subject to extortion, quite terrible beatings at the state as well. And I think that point that you mentioned about there were lots of nice PR exercises that seemed to happen after August 2021 about Pakistan planes going to be the first ones to fly from Kabul to Islamabad. But actually the visa process was incredibly difficult, and wanting this, at best, you could say that the state has allowed itself to be a site of transit, but the message has been actually quite clear that, new folks aren't really welcome within the country anymore. And I think that that adds a whole other level of questioning onto whether one can even access, better infrastructures and the like, of whether people are even able to move now. And of course, there are people who do have family within the country, particularly in the socioeconomic groups that I was working in, who've really been trying very, very hard to get reunified with their family members, but are just coming up time and time again with kind of like bureaucratic barriers and political barriers, quite frankly, that are making it very, very hard for folks to do that. But sorry, back to you, Natasha.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes left if folks have other questions they'd like to post in the chat, or additional comments. And I wanted to, I know Sanaa mentioned that you met in SOAS and you're meeting again virtually, and you started your PhDs at the same time. So if you wanted to speak, Aziz, to how knowledge production has changed, knowledge production on Afghanistan has changed during the time that you've been doing your work, and especially now post 2021, working in Afghanistan, how things have changed, if you'd like to share.
Sure. I mean, when I was working, when I started my PhD, this was the height of the surge, if you like. The Americans had just sent in troops, and I think there was more than 100,000 foreign troops in the country. There was and of course, with the military moved in and with counterinsurgency, there's quite a lot of demand for sort of cultural knowledge. The Americans wanted to understand how Afghan society worked, who are the influential people, that there was a lot of mapping, social mapping that was going on. And a lot of anthropologists were also, part of this endeavor. You would run into them in the field, and they were, of course, serving sort of that need for cultural knowledge. And as an Afghan, of course, it was not easy to navigate within that environment, and having to constantly sort of push against this kind of sort of simplistic, essentialist narratives about tribal society. Just never had a sort of a centralized state, and and so on and so forth, and looking for the elders, because the idea that if you can ally with the elder, and you would get all the young people who follow the elder. And of course, Afghanistan had changed in the last 30 or 40 years, and a lot of them were killed by the communists, and those who were still alive were very reluctant, because of course they were very concerned about being targeted by the Taliban. So they were the fact that there was the Americans were trying to find him and approached him, made him a target, assassin. And the Taliban assassinated quite a lot of elders, including religious leaders. So in a sense, that there was a lot of what Sanaa mentioned, the sort of Orientalist tropes were around, were there, and this has a very long history, also in the context of course, of the counterinsurgency literature and debates. The Americans were borrowing from the British examples in Malaya, the French in Algeria, so there was a lot of that, and my work partly sort of speaks to that, and sort of critiques that idea of Afghanistan, the sort of static culture, and Afghanistan being, sort of the borderland, the backyard, and so on and so forth, inconsequential, and of course now, I mean, in the last couple of years, it has become very difficult even for people like me who have family and friends there. It's not easy to go back and do research, and the impressions that we get are basically from journalists and those who are still able to go, but doing the kind of, and I'm hoping that the situation will improve, because I would love to go back and spend time, now that at least, war in the big sense of, is over. There's no longer sort of fighting between government forces and Taliban, but the war hasn't really ended, and that's an important. I think it's important to mention that Afghanistan is still, the Americans continue to bombard it using drones. There's still, the Taliban are now have basically replaced the government, and they are now subjected to suicide bombings, or at least, there's been attacks on mosques, and there's been attacks on schools, and so it's not a easy place to visit and to conduct work. And of course, the Taliban are also very suspicious of who comes in and reports and what kind of reporting they do. Of course, we are not journalists, but even researchers would probably find it quite difficult to navigate that environment. So I don't have a very good sense really, but for I have a family, so I have to make these calculations, and I don't feel comfortable right now to go back and do research. Maybe it will improve in a few years. We never know.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I guess one kind of question to wrap up is a frame question about, Sanaa, your frame of refugee cities. I think what's really exciting about your work is showing us how refugees and migrants are enacting belonging locally and rejecting the nation as an organizing principle. And in your book, you talk about this being the case in Pakistan, but also across South Asia. And I couldn't help but think when reading about Karachi, just the layers of it itself as a refugee city with muhajirs and refugees that had to flee Sindh too. So could you speak about how you see refugee cities as a framework for thinking beyond the nation across South Asia? And then maybe Aziz too, internationally, how can we think of refugee cities as a framework for thinking beyond the nation globally too, in terms of thinking of Turkey as a city with a lot of migrants and refugees? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. So thank you for that. I think that's an important question. I think that when you think of, refugee cities, you will also think of kind of Calcutta. You will also think of like Bangladesh and Rohingya refugees in Myanmar, and you will think of so many different kind of contexts and situations within the global South, the region of Central Asia and of South Asia, and also, of course, beyond that. And for Pakistani who was writing this book, there is, of course, that big story of partition is the refugee story that everyone will learn from the first book that they read in class, right? That's on the curriculum, it's in the narratives, it's embedded and imprinted into day-to-day life. And what I wanted to do was to actually move the refugee story of Pakistan beyond that 1947 almost prison that we, the prison of pain that people kind of like to undergo, not necessarily just because of the pain that people really underwent and suffered with, but about that nation building exercise. So part of that is to also kind of like challenge that refugee narrative within the context of Pakistan, but also to kind of show it how it is that local spaces, local neighborhoods, and certain within urban areas where you have different nationalities, ethnicities, and even class groupings living side by side with each other is an important space of inclusion and organizing. It's not that the city is, you can see from the case studies and folks that I work with, the city has its own problems, it's exclusionary, it's precarious, and it has a number of problems, but the city also becomes a very important site because of frequency of interactions, because of proximity of relationships, because of a shared reliance on folks and people to survive and to thrive, that you can have, and you do have, acts of important solidarity, and without realizing it, day-to-day organizations taking place that are trying to improve the people's lives, that are much less exclusionary and jingoistic and nationalistic than the nation and that broader level allows. So I see the city as a very important site of forms of organic organizing. And that's something that you can see in the context of the South, but also certainly in context of metropoles like London, Berlin and other spaces as well, and certainly in the US context as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important message that I think resonates throughout your book, the ability of cities to, absorb all sorts of nationalities. And I mean, for me, what stood out was also the both the hope that cities provide that kind of a cushion for a lot of Afghans, but also at the same time, the refusal of the Pakistani state to sort of grant them nationality puts them in a very precarious position. So they have to fight the state in order to remain within that state, and that's a difficult struggle. And they will always be subjected to this kind of arbitrary treatment every time the relations between the two countries deteriorate. There would be a pushback against them. Or if the economic situation deteriorates and Afghans the cheap labor is no longer needed, as is the case in Turkey, they will be pushed away and they will be deported. So in that sense, of course, we cannot wish away the nation state. The nation state as a framework will continue to create these kind of boundaries and reinforce borders. And unfortunately, what we're seeing, at least in relation to Turkey, but also in relation to Pakistan, it's making it very difficult, at least for newcomers to come in. You talk about, post 2001, or the context of the war on terror. The Pakistanis are now also no longer seeing Afghans as refugees in the in the old sense in the 80s. There is also an attempt to push them back. So it is. I'm a bit studying migration in the region. Even if you move to Central Asia, the borders are getting very, very difficult to cross, especially for Afghans. It's almost, the country's been turned into an open air prison in a sense for a lot of people, because the barriers to cross borders has become so difficult. So yeah, it's not. I mean, I wanted to end it, of course, with a hopeful note, but sometimes it's not possible.
Well, yeah, I think that should perhaps cause us, importantly, spaces to reflect, to be honest than hopeful, because there's much more work to be done. And I think that Neela also, of course, brings that point in the chat as well, is that, referring to the point that you've made, is that, of course, the war has not ended in Afghanistan as well. And
absolutely.
It's not.
Right. And Saida also leaves us with a heavy question to consider and reflect on in terms of thinking about how our own knowledge production and research may be kind of implicated in the strengthening of empire. But yes, to echo Neela in the chat, you both give us hope. And thank you so much for your time and sharing with us. And really great to hear you both in conversation. So I'll turn it over to Iftikhar to close.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, and for really addressing this important topic. And we hope to, at Cornell, we've been the South Asia program. We've been involved in the rescue of Afghan scholars as well as students, and we hope to continue to do more programming on Afghanistan and going forward. And thanks to everyone who's attended and your questions and your interventions.
Thank you.